The rain hit the windows like small stones, and 11-year-old Daniel pressed his palm against the cold glass of the community center, watching a woman inside lock the doors for the night. He had run 3 streets in the storm just to reach this place before closing time, his shoes soaked through, his breath coming out in short clouds. He knocked once, twice, but the woman only shook her head and pointed at the sign that read closed. Daniel stepped back into the rain, his chest tight with disappointment, and looked up at the darkening sky as thunder rolled somewhere far away. This was not the first door that had closed on him, and he already understood, at his young age, that it would not be the last. He lived with his mother, Grace, in a narrow apartment above a laundromat on the edge of town, where the walls were thin enough to hear the dryers thumping through the night. Grace worked long hours cleaning houses across the city, coming home with sore hands and tired eyes, yet she never once complained in front of her son. She wanted better for Daniel, though she did not know how to give it to him. Money was always short, and dreams, in their household, were treated like a luxury item that nobody could afford. Daniel had discovered music almost by accident. When he was 6 years old, his mother had brought home a broken keyboard someone had left outside a second-hand shop, its plastic casing cracked and half its keys silent. She had meant it as a toy, something to keep him occupied while she worked double shifts, but for Daniel it became something far greater. He would sit for hours pressing down keys, listening to the notes that still worked, arranging them in patterns that seemed to arrive in his mind before his fingers could catch up. He did not know the names of the notes. He did not know a single rule of music theory. He only knew that certain sounds, placed one after another in a particular order, could make his chest ache in a good way, could make him forget, for a little while, that his shoes had holes in them, and that dinner some nights was only bread. By the time he was 11, Daniel had taught himself to play simple songs he heard on the radio of a neighbor's shop, songs that drifted through the open windows of the laundromat below. He had never had a lesson. He had never touched a real piano, one with all 88 keys in working order, one that could fill a room with sound the way he imagined it could. The community center down the street had a small upright piano in its back room, and sometimes, if the door was left open, Daniel would stand outside and listen to older students practice their scales, his heart pounding with a longing he could not fully explain even to himself. That evening, soaked from the rain and turned away once again, Daniel walked home slowly, kicking a stone along the wet pavement. He passed by the town's grand concert hall, a building he had walked past countless times but never dared to enter. It was a place for people with money, for families who wore fine coats and arrived in clean cars, not for a boy whose jacket was 2 sizes too small and whose pockets were always empty. Tonight, however, something was different. Through a side door left slightly open by a careless stagehand, Daniel could hear the faint, rich sound of an orchestra rehearsing, violins weaving together with the low hum of cellos, and beneath it all, the sound he loved most, the deep and commanding voice of a grand piano. He knew he should keep walking. He knew that boys like him were not welcome in places like this, but his feet seemed to move on their own, carrying him toward the sound, and before he understood what he was doing, he had slipped through the gap in the door and into a narrow hallway that smelled of polished wood and old velvet curtains. The music grew louder with every step, pulling him forward the way a current pulls a small boat, and soon he found himself standing in the wings of a massive stage, hidden behind a heavy black curtain, watching a full orchestra move through a piece he did not know the name of but felt instantly in his bones. At the center of it all sat a piano unlike anything Daniel had ever seen. It was enormous, its black surface gleaming under the stage lights, its lid propped open like the wing of some magnificent bird ready to take flight. The pianist playing it that evening was skilled, competent, unremarkable in the way that professionals sometimes are when they play from habit rather than hunger. Daniel barely noticed the man at all. His eyes were fixed entirely on the instrument itself, on the way its polished wood caught the light, on the promise held inside those 88 keys. The rehearsal ended sooner than Daniel expected. Musicians began packing away their instruments, chatting quietly among themselves, drifting off the stage in small groups toward the exits. Within a few minutes, the enormous hall had emptied almost entirely. The house lights dimmed to a soft glow, and the grand piano sat alone on the stage, abandoned and silent, waiting. Daniel knew he should leave. Every instinct told him to slip back through the side door and disappear into the rainy night before anyone noticed him. But the piano seemed to call to him with a pull stronger than caution, stronger than fear of being caught, stronger than the voice in his head reminding him that he did not belong in a place like this. Slowly, quietly, he stepped out from behind the curtain and crossed the empty stage, his wet shoes leaving small dark marks on the polished floor. He reached the piano bench and hesitated only a moment before sitting down, his small frame swallowed by the size of the instrument in front of him. His fingers trembled slightly as he raised them above the keys, uncertain, almost afraid to touch something so beautiful. Then, without fully deciding to, he pressed down on a single key, and the sound that filled the hall was unlike anything he had ever produced on his broken second-hand keyboard. It was rich and full and alive, vibrating through the wooden floor and up into his chest, and something inside Daniel simply let go. He closed his eyes, the way he always did when he played, shutting out the enormous empty hall, the rows of dark velvet seats, the weight of everything he was not supposed to be doing. His fingers began to move across the keys, hesitant at first, then growing more confident with every note, finding a melody that seemed to rise up from somewhere deep inside him, rather than from any memory or lesson. He had no idea what the notes were called. He only knew where his fingers wanted to go next, guided by an instinct that felt less like learning, and more like remembering something he had always known. The music that poured out of him was strange and beautiful, part sorrow and part hope, carrying within it every hard night his family had endured, every closed door, every empty stomach, every quiet moment of longing he had felt standing outside that community center window. He did not notice the footsteps approaching from the side of the stage. He did not notice the tall figure standing frozen in the wings, staring at him with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and fury. Daniel was somewhere else entirely, somewhere the rain could not reach him, somewhere poverty had no power over him at all. The figure watching him was Alaric Voss, the conductor of the city's orchestra, a man known throughout the music world for his exacting standards and his short temper. Alaric had returned to the concert hall to retrieve a folder of sheet music he had forgotten, expecting an empty and silent stage. Instead, he found a ragged boy, soaked from the storm outside, seated at his prized instrument, playing without any invitation whatsoever. For a moment, shock kept him rooted in place. Then anger took over, sharp and immediate, the kind of anger that came from years of guarding something precious against careless hands. He strode across the stage with heavy, deliberate steps, his shoes striking the polished floor like small explosions in the silence. Daniel, lost in his music, did not hear him approach until a shadow fell across the keys, and a voice erupted like a thunderclap directly above him. "Don't touch my piano, poor guy," Alaric shouted, his face flushed with anger, his hand already reaching out as if to yank the boy from the bench. Daniel's eyes snapped open, and for a terrifying instant he froze completely, his hands still resting on the keys, his heart pounding so hard he was certain the entire hall could hear it. He had been caught. He had broken a rule he had known perfectly well he was breaking, and now a grown man twice his size was standing over him, furious, ready to throw him out into the storm. Daniel scrambled backward off the bench so quickly he nearly fell, mumbling apologies that tumbled over each other, backing away toward the edge of the stage with his hands raised as if to show he had taken nothing, damaged nothing. Alaric's sharp eyes followed him, cold and unforgiving, and for a moment it seemed the encounter would end exactly as Daniel feared, with humiliation and a hurried escape into the wet night. Another door closed against him. But something in the air had shifted, though neither of them yet understood it. The final notes Daniel had played still seemed to hang in the vast empty hall, refusing to fade completely, and somewhere beneath his anger, Alaric Voss had heard something he could not quite dismiss. He had spent 30 years surrounded by music, by talented performers and gifted students, and yet the sound this ragged, trembling boy had drawn from his piano moments earlier had struck him with a force he had not felt in a very long time. He said nothing more as Daniel edged toward the side door, disappearing back into the rain as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving behind only the echo of a melody that Alaric Voss would find himself unable to forget. For 3 days after that night, Alaric Voss could not shake the memory of the boy at his piano. He tried to bury himself in rehearsals, in the endless demands of preparing his orchestra for an upcoming performance, but every time silence settled around him, the melody returned, uninvited, playing itself over and over in his mind. He was a man who trusted only what he could measure, who judged musicians by years of training and technical precision, and yet nothing about what he had heard fit into any category he understood. The boy had broken every rule of proper form, every principle Alaric had spent his life defending, and still the sound had reached somewhere inside him that trained musicians rarely touched. He told himself repeatedly that it meant nothing, that childhood talent was common, and usually faded before it ever became anything real. He told himself he had far more important matters demanding his attention. Yet on the 4th morning, before the sun had fully risen, Alaric found himself walking through streets he had never had reason to visit, past shuttered shops and cracked pavements, asking a fruit seller near the concert hall if he knew of a boy who lived nearby, a boy with quick hands and a hungry look in his eyes. The fruit seller, a cheerful man named Edward, laughed and said that description could belong to half the children in the neighborhood, but after a moment of thought, he pointed Alaric toward the laundromat on the corner, mentioning a woman named Grace who lived above it with her son. Alaric stood outside the building for several minutes before finally climbing the narrow staircase and knocking on the apartment door. Grace opened it cautiously, wiping her hands on a worn apron, clearly startled to find a stranger in an expensive coat standing in her hallway. Behind her, Daniel appeared in the doorway of the small kitchen, and the moment his eyes met the conductor's, his face went pale with recognition and dread. He was certain, in that instant, that he was about to be punished for what he had done, perhaps reported to someone, perhaps banned forever from ever setting foot near the concert hall again. Instead, Alaric cleared his throat awkwardly, a man clearly unaccustomed to standing in doorways explaining himself to strangers, and said that he wished to speak with the boy about his playing. Grace, protective and confused, asked what exactly her son had done, her voice tightening with worry that Daniel had gotten himself into some kind of trouble. Alaric assured her, though not warmly, that no laws had been broken, only that he had heard something in her son's playing that he could not easily explain, and he wanted to know where the boy had studied. When Daniel admitted, quietly and with visible embarrassment, that he had never studied anywhere, that he had taught himself using a broken keyboard found outside a second-hand shop, Alaric fell silent for a long moment. It did not match anything in his experience. Self-taught musicians existed, certainly, but rarely did they produce anything beyond simple imitation, and what he had heard in the concert hall had been something else entirely, something that felt discovered rather than copied. He looked at Daniel carefully, taking in the boy's worn clothes, his mother's tired eyes, the small apartment with its peeling paint, and something shifted behind his stern expression, though he did his best to hide it. He made an offer that afternoon, though he delivered it more like an order than an invitation. The boy would come to the concert hall 3 afternoons each week. He would be taught properly, from the beginning, with real instruction and real discipline, and in exchange he would follow every instruction given to him without complaint or hesitation. Grace, torn between suspicion of this stern stranger and a desperate hope that perhaps something good had finally found her son, agreed cautiously, on the condition that she would accompany Daniel for the first lesson to see this arrangement for herself. The following week, Daniel stepped into the concert hall for the second time, though this visit felt entirely different from the first. He was not sneaking through a side door in the rain now, hidden and afraid. He was walking through the main entrance beside his mother, his heart pounding with a nervous excitement he had never experienced before. The hall looked even larger in daylight, its ceiling stretching high above rows of empty seats, sunlight falling through tall windows onto the same grand piano he had touched only once before. Alaric was waiting for them near the stage, dressed in the same severe manner as before, his expression unreadable. He greeted Grace with brief politeness before turning his full attention to Daniel, instructing him to sit at the piano and demonstrate everything he knew. Daniel's hands shook slightly as he lowered himself onto the bench, painfully aware of the conductor's sharp eyes studying his every movement. He played the same melody he had discovered days earlier, though nervousness made his fingers stumble in places they had not stumbled before. When he finished, Alaric said nothing for a long, uncomfortable moment, simply staring at the keys as though replaying what he had heard. Then, without warmth, he began correcting Daniel's posture, adjusting the position of his wrists, explaining the proper way to hold his hands above the keys. Daniel had expected praise, some acknowledgement of what he had accomplished entirely on his own, but instead he received only criticism, delivered in a tone that made him feel smaller with every sentence. He left that first lesson confused and slightly wounded, uncertain whether this stern man actually believed in him or simply saw him as a curiosity to be examined and corrected. The weeks that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Daniel arrived 3 afternoons each week, working through scales and exercises that felt tedious compared to the freedom he had once found in simply letting his fingers wander across the keys. Alaric proved to be a demanding teacher, quick to point out every flaw, rarely offering encouragement even when Daniel made clear progress. There were afternoons when Daniel left the concert hall close to tears, frustrated by his own mistakes and by his teacher's apparent inability to acknowledge anything he did correctly. He began to resent the older man's coldness, wondering privately whether he had simply traded one kind of hardship for another. Alaric, for his part, struggled with feelings he did not fully understand himself. He had spent decades building a reputation on discipline and precision, and something about this untrained boy unsettled the careful order he had constructed around his professional life. He doubted some days whether he was doing the boy any favors at all, wondering if he was simply imposing rigid structure onto a talent that had thrived precisely because it had never been constrained. Yet whenever Daniel played something entirely his own, something born from instinct rather than instruction, Alaric found himself standing perfectly still, listening in a way he rarely allowed himself to listen to anyone. One particular afternoon, several weeks into their lessons, everything between them nearly fell apart entirely. Daniel had struggled for over an hour with a technical exercise Alaric insisted he master before moving forward, his fingers refusing to cooperate no matter how many times he attempted the passage. Exhausted and humiliated, he finally slammed his hands down on the keys in frustration, producing a harsh, discordant sound that echoed through the empty hall. Alaric's expression darkened immediately, and he began speaking sharply about discipline, about how talent without structure amounted to nothing, about how Daniel would never become a real musician if he could not master even the simplest exercises. Something inside Daniel snapped in that moment, and he rose from the bench, shouting back that he had never asked to be taught this way, that he had been perfectly happy playing music that came from his own heart before Alaric had appeared and told him it was wrong. He said he did not need permission to feel something when he played, and that all the rules in the world could not replace whatever it was that had made Alaric stop and listen that first rainy night. He grabbed his worn jacket from the chair where he had left it, and stormed toward the exit, leaving Alaric standing alone beside the piano, stunned into silence by the outburst. For several days afterward, Daniel did not return to the concert hall. He told his mother, unconvincingly, that he had simply lost interest, though Grace could see clearly that something deeper had wounded her son. She did not push him to explain, though she watched him closely, noticing how he avoided even glancing toward the second-hand keyboard sitting untouched in the corner of their small living room. The instrument that had once been his greatest joy, now gathering dust in silence. Alaric, meanwhile, spent those same days replaying the argument in his mind, surprised by how much the boy's absence bothered him. He had taught many students over the years, some talented, most forgettable, and none of them had ever affected him the way this ragged, self-taught boy had. He began to understand, slowly and reluctantly, that perhaps his rigid methods had been the wrong approach entirely, that perhaps what made Daniel remarkable was precisely the instinct Alaric had been trying to suppress rather than nurture. On the 6th day of Daniel's absence, Alaric appeared once again at the small apartment above the laundromat, though this time his demeanor had changed noticeably. He apologized, awkwardly and without much practice at the gesture, admitting that he had perhaps focused too heavily on correcting what he saw as flaws, without ever acknowledging the extraordinary gift that had brought them together in the first place. He proposed a new arrangement, one where technical training would continue, but where Daniel would also be encouraged, even during lessons, to play freely, to let his instincts guide him the way they had that rainy night on the empty stage. Daniel listened silently, still hurt but also surprised by the older man's willingness to admit fault. After a long pause, he agreed to return, though he made clear that he would not abandon the part of himself that had first discovered music through feeling rather than formal rules. Alaric nodded, something close to respect flickering briefly across his stern features. And from that day forward, their lessons began to change in tone, becoming less a battle of wills and more a genuine exchange between teacher and student, each learning something unexpected from the other. As autumn deepened and the weeks passed, Daniel's technical skill grew steadily alongside his natural instinct, the two elements gradually weaving together into something increasingly powerful. Word began to travel quietly through certain circles of the local music community that Alaric Voss, a man famous for his impatience with anything less than excellence, had taken on a student from one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city, a boy with no formal training who had somehow captured the attention of one of the most demanding conductors in the region. Some dismissed the rumor as exaggeration, others grew curious, and a few grew suspicious, wondering what exactly this unusual pairing might mean for the carefully guarded traditions of the music world they had spent their lives protecting. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a cold that seeped through the walls of the apartment above the laundromat and made Grace's joints ache after long days spent scrubbing floors in houses far grander than her own. Daniel noticed the way she rubbed her hands together each evening, the way she sometimes winced when climbing the narrow staircase to their front door, though she never once complained aloud. He began to understand, in a way he had not fully grasped before, that his mother's sacrifices had a cost she carried silently, and this understanding settled into his chest with a weight that made him practice harder, as though skill alone might somehow lighten her burden. His lessons with Alaric had deepened considerably since their disagreement months earlier. The stiff formality between them had softened into something resembling genuine partnership, though Alaric remained exacting in his standards, never allowing sloppiness to pass unnoticed. Daniel had grown accustomed to the rhythm of their sessions now, arriving each afternoon to the familiar creak of the concert hall's heavy doors, the smell of polished wood and old velvet that had once felt foreign to him, and now felt almost like a second home. His fingers had grown stronger, more precise, capable of technical passages that would have seemed impossible to him only months earlier. Yet Alaric had been careful never to let structure smother the instinctive quality that made Daniel's playing so distinctive. One afternoon in early winter, Alaric arrived at their lesson with something clearly weighing on his mind. He explained, choosing his words carefully, that he had been invited to a private gathering hosted by Margaret Ashwell, a wealthy patron of the arts who funded much of the concert hall's programming and who held considerable influence over which young musicians received scholarships and opportunities within the city's musical circles. Alaric intended to bring Daniel along, not as a formal performer, but simply as a guest who might, if the moment felt right, play something for the assembled crowd. Daniel felt his stomach tighten at the suggestion. He had grown comfortable playing for Alaric alone, within the safety of their private lessons, but the thought of performing in front of strangers, people with money and standing and opinions about who belonged in their world, filled him with a nervousness he had not anticipated. Alaric, sensing his hesitation, spoke to him plainly, telling him that talent hidden away in an empty concert hall would never change anything, that if Daniel wished for a future in music, he would eventually need to prove himself before people who might doubt him simply because of where he came from. The evening of the gathering arrived with a bitter chill in the air. Grace had carefully mended Daniel's only decent shirt, pressing it smooth with painstaking attention, and though the outfit still looked modest compared to what other guests would surely wear, Daniel felt a small swell of pride as he walked beside Alaric toward the grand house on the hill overlooking the city. The building was unlike anything Daniel had ever entered, with high ceilings, gleaming chandeliers, and rooms filled with people whose laughter carried the easy confidence of those who had never once worried about an empty pantry. He felt profoundly out of place from the moment he stepped through the door. Guests glanced at him with polite curiosity, clearly wondering why a boy in a simple, carefully pressed shirt had been brought into their midst. Alaric introduced him briefly to a few acquaintances, explaining that Daniel was a promising young student, though he offered no further details about his background. Daniel stood quietly near the edge of the room for much of the evening, watching well-dressed children his own age chat easily with each other, feeling the distance between his life and theirs stretch wider with every passing minute. Among the guests that evening was a boy named Oliver Barrington, the son of a respected violinist and himself considered something of a prodigy within certain circles of the city's music community. Oliver had studied formally since the age of 4, trained by some of the finest instructors money could provide, and he carried himself with the easy assurance of someone who had never once doubted his place among the talented and privileged. When he learned that Daniel was Alaric's newest student, his polite curiosity quickly shifted into something sharper, edged with condescension he made little effort to hide. Oliver approached Daniel near the refreshment table, asking with feigned innocence where exactly he had studied before coming to Alaric, which conservatory, which teacher had prepared him for such an opportunity. Daniel, uncomfortable but unwilling to lie, admitted quietly that he had never had formal lessons before meeting Alaric, that he had taught himself using a broken keyboard he had found near his home. A few nearby guests overheard the exchange, and Daniel caught the flicker of surprise and thinly veiled skepticism that passed across their faces. Oliver smiled thinly and remarked that it seemed unusual for someone with no real training to be present at such a gathering, wondering aloud whether Alaric had perhaps taken pity on him rather than recognized any genuine promise. The comment stung more than Daniel wanted to admit, striking at fears he had carried privately since the very beginning of his lessons. He said nothing in response, retreating instead toward a quiet corner of the room, his earlier nervousness now tangled with a fresh humiliation he did not know how to shake off. Alaric, occupied in conversation with several other guests across the room, did not witness the exchange, though he noticed later how withdrawn and uncomfortable his young student had become. As the evening wore on, Margaret Ashwell, the gathering's hostess, gently suggested that the assembled young musicians might offer a small demonstration of their talents, a common tradition at her events meant to showcase the promising students supported by the city's music community. Several children performed brief pieces on a piano positioned near the grand fireplace, each polished and technically accomplished, drawing polite applause from the appreciative crowd. Oliver Barrington performed last among them, delivering a flawless, precisely executed piece that earned enthusiastic praise from nearly everyone in the room, his confidence radiating outward as he returned to his seat amid warm congratulations. Margaret then turned her attention toward Alaric, asking with genuine curiosity whether his new student might also wish to play something for the gathered guests. Daniel felt every eye in the room shift toward him, and for a terrible moment he considered declining entirely, retreating from the humiliation he feared awaited him if he failed in front of these people who had already decided, based on nothing more than his background, that he did not belong among them. Alaric caught his gaze from across the room, and though he said nothing aloud, Something in his steady expression seemed to remind Daniel of everything they had worked through together since that rainy night months earlier. Slowly, Daniel rose from his seat and crossed toward the piano, aware of Oliver's smirk lingering somewhere at the edge of his vision, aware of the quiet murmurs rippling through the crowd as they studied his simple clothing, his obvious nervousness. He settled onto the bench and rested his hands above the keys, and for a moment, doubt threatened to overwhelm him entirely. Then he closed his eyes, the way he always did, and let the noise of the room fade away completely, replacing it with the only thing that had ever truly belonged to him. What emerged from beneath his fingers bore little resemblance to the polished, technically precise pieces the other children had performed that evening. It was something rawer, something that seemed to rise directly from the difficult winters his family had endured, from the ache in his mother's hands, from the loneliness of standing outside locked doors in the rain. The melody wound through moments of quiet sorrow, before building into passages of surprising strength, each note placed with an instinct that no amount of formal training could have taught him. The room, which had been filled with polite chatter only moments before, grew steadily silent, guests turning fully toward the piano, their earlier condescension replaced by something closer to astonishment. When Daniel finally lifted his hands from the keys, the silence stretched for several long seconds before the room erupted into applause far more enthusiastic than anything offered to the evening's earlier performers. Margaret Ashwell rose from her seat, visibly moved, declaring that she had rarely heard anything quite so affecting in all her years of hosting such gatherings. Even Oliver Barrington, standing near the back of the room, wore an expression that had shifted from smug condescension to something closer to grudging surprise, though he said nothing aloud. Alaric crossed the room afterward, and though he offered no dramatic display of emotion in front of the assembled guests, the look he gave Daniel carried a warmth that had rarely appeared during their more formal lessons. He spoke quietly, telling Daniel that he had just given the finest performance of his young life, one built not on imitation, but on something far rarer, an authentic voice that could not be taught through scales and exercises alone. Daniel, still trembling slightly from the intensity of the moment, felt something loosen in his chest that had been tightly wound since the first sharp comment Oliver had made near the refreshment table. News of the performance spread quickly through the city's tightly knit music community over the following weeks. Some spoke of it with genuine admiration, praising Alaric for discovering such an unusual and powerful talent. Others remained skeptical, suggesting privately that a single striking performance at a private gathering proved little, that true musicianship required consistency and discipline that could only be demonstrated through rigorous formal evaluation. Margaret Ashwell herself, impressed and intrigued by what she had witnessed, began making quiet inquiries about arranging a more significant opportunity for the boy, something that might allow him to prove himself before a wider and more demanding audience. Meanwhile, at home, Grace noticed a change in her son that filled her with cautious hope. Daniel returned from his lessons with a new sense of purpose, practicing late into the evening on the second-hand keyboard that had once gathered dust in the corner of their living room. She began taking on additional cleaning work whenever possible, determined to save whatever small amount she could toward the possibility, however distant it still seemed, of a future where her son's talent might carry him somewhere she herself had never been able to reach. She never spoke openly of these hopes, unwilling to place pressure on shoulders already carrying so much, but Daniel could see the quiet determination in the way she counted coins late at night at their kitchen table, and it strengthened his resolve to prove that her sacrifices had not been made in vain. As winter deepened further and the city prepared for the coldest months ahead, whispers of Daniel's unusual talent continued spreading through circles that had once seemed entirely closed to someone of his background. Alaric began receiving quiet questions from colleagues, curious about the boy from the laundromat who had captured Margaret Ashwell's attention with a single, unforgettable performance. Though he remained cautious about the growing attention, wary of exposing his young student to expectations he was not yet ready to bear, Alaric could not deny that something had shifted irreversibly since that stormy night when he had first shouted at a ragged boy sitting uninvited at his precious piano. A door had opened, however narrowly, and neither of them could fully predict where the path beyond it might lead. 2 weeks after the gathering at Margaret Ashwell's home, Alaric received a formal letter from the city's conservatory board, an organization responsible for granting scholarships and admission to the region's most prestigious music program. The letter, signed by the board's chairman, a stern and widely respected musician named Victor Langley, requested that Alaric bring his unusual new student before a formal panel for evaluation. Word of the private performance had reached the board through Margaret's enthusiastic recommendation, though the tone of the letter made clear that admiration alone would not be enough to secure Daniel a place among the conservatory's students. Alaric read the letter twice before setting it down on his desk, a familiar tightness gathering in his chest. He knew Victor Langley personally, had known him for over 20 years, and understood precisely the kind of scrutiny the chairman would bring to such an evaluation. Langley believed firmly in tradition, in the importance of formal training beginning at an early age, in the idea that true musicianship could only be cultivated through years of disciplined study under recognized instructors. A boy who had taught himself using a broken keyboard found outside a second-hand shop represented, to men like Langley, everything unpredictable and unproven that the conservatory's rigorous admission standards existed to filter out. When Alaric explained the invitation to Daniel during their next lesson, he watched carefully for signs of the same nervousness that had gripped his student before the performance at Margaret's gathering. This time, however, the stakes felt considerably higher. A private performance among curious guests was one matter, but a formal evaluation before the conservatory board carried consequences that could shape the entire course of Daniel's future. Acceptance would mean scholarships, proper training, opportunities that had never before seemed within reach for a boy from his neighborhood. Rejection would confirm every doubt Daniel had ever harbored about whether someone like him truly belonged in the world Alaric had begun opening up to him. Daniel absorbed the news quietly, his expression difficult to read. After a long pause, he asked what exactly the evaluation would involve, and Alaric explained that Daniel would need to perform 2 pieces before the panel, one demonstrating technical control through a formally structured composition, and one entirely of his own choosing, meant to showcase whatever unique quality had first captured everyone's attention. The board would then deliberate and vote on whether to extend an offer of admission and scholarship support, a decision that would be communicated within days of the evaluation itself. The weeks leading up to the evaluation brought an intensity to their lessons that neither of them had experienced before. Alaric drilled Daniel relentlessly on the technical piece, a demanding composition that required precise control and unwavering discipline, the kind of piece that left little room for instinct or improvisation. Daniel, though frustrated at times by the rigid structure, understood the necessity of proving he could master formal technique alongside his natural gift, and he practiced with a determination that impressed even his exacting teacher. At home, however, circumstances took a difficult turn that threatened to derail everything they had worked toward. Grace, exhausted from months of additional cleaning work taken on to support her son's growing opportunities, fell seriously ill with a fever that left her bedridden for several days. Daniel found himself torn between his need to continue practicing for the upcoming evaluation and his responsibility to care for his mother, who had sacrificed so much for him without ever asking for anything in return. He spent his evenings preparing simple meals, applying cool cloths to her forehead, and sitting beside her bed long after she had fallen into uneasy sleep, his heart heavy with worry that pulled his focus far away from scales and technical exercises. When Alaric learned of Grace's illness during a lesson where Daniel's usual concentration had noticeably faltered, he offered, somewhat awkwardly, to arrange for a doctor to visit the small apartment above the laundromat, an expense Daniel knew his family could never have afforded on their own. Grace protested weakly against accepting such charity, her pride bruised by circumstances that had already forced her to rely on the kindness of a stranger for her son's opportunities, but Daniel gently convinced her to accept, reminding her that pride would matter little if her health continued declining. The doctor's visit revealed nothing more serious than severe exhaustion combined with a stubborn fever, and within a week, with proper rest and medicine, Grace began slowly regaining her strength. The experience, though frightening, left Daniel with a renewed and sharpened determination. He returned to his lessons with an intensity that surprised even Alaric, pouring every ounce of worry and fear he had carried during his mother's illness directly into his practice sessions. The technical piece, once a source of frustration, gradually became something he could execute with genuine confidence, while the freedom he brought to his own compositions grew even more powerful, infused now with the raw emotion of everything his family had recently endured. As the date of the evaluation approached, word of the upcoming event spread further through the city's music community, carrying with it a mixture of curiosity and doubt. Oliver Barrington, still smarting from the unexpected impression Daniel had made at Margaret Ashwell's gathering, made little effort to hide his skepticism among his own circle of friends and fellow students, suggesting that a single emotional performance meant nothing when measured against years of proper training. Some members of the conservatory board privately echoed similar doubts, wondering whether Alaric's judgment had been clouded by sentiment rather than genuine musical assessment. Victor Langley himself remained publicly neutral but privately skeptical, determined to evaluate the boy with the same rigorous standards applied to every other applicant, regardless of the enthusiasm surrounding his unusual story. 3 days before the formal evaluation, Alaric arranged for Daniel to rehearse in the actual hall where the panel would gather. wanting his student to grow familiar with the space rather than face its unfamiliar formality for the first time under pressure. The room proved smaller and more intimidating than the grand concert hall Daniel had grown accustomed to, its walls lined with portraits of distinguished former students and faculty, its atmosphere heavy with generations of tradition that seemed to press down on anyone who entered seeking approval. Daniel felt the weight of that history settle uncomfortably over him as he sat at the piano positioned at the center of the room, imagining the panel of stern faces that would soon judge whether he belonged among the names immortalized on those walls. Alaric watched his student closely during that private rehearsal, noting the tension visible in Daniel's shoulders, the slight hesitation that had crept back into his playing despite months of steady progress. He recognized the fear for what it was, not a lack of talent or preparation, but the natural weight of understanding exactly how much rested on a single afternoon's performance. He spoke to Daniel plainly after the rehearsal ended, reminding him that the panel would be listening for technical precision, certainly, but that no amount of flawless execution could replace the authentic voice that had first stopped Alaric in his tracks on a rainy night many months earlier. He told Daniel to trust the same instinct that had carried him through every difficult moment since then, the instinct that had turned a broken keyboard and an empty stage into the beginning of something neither of them had fully understood at the time. That evening, walking home together through streets already growing dark with the early arrival of winter dusk, Daniel asked Alaric quietly whether he truly believed the panel would accept him, or whether men like Victor Langley had already decided, long before hearing a single note, that a boy from his background could never belong among their carefully cultivated students. Alaric considered the question seriously before answering, admitting honestly that he could not guarantee the outcome, that prejudice and tradition sometimes proved more stubborn than even the most extraordinary talent. But he added, with a conviction that surprised them both, that regardless of the board's decision, nothing could erase what Daniel had already accomplished, transforming himself from a boy who had never touched a proper piano into a musician capable of moving an entire room to stunned silence through nothing more than the honest expression of everything he had lived through. The words offered little certainty, but they settled something restless in Daniel's chest as they continued walking through the cold evening streets. Whatever happened in the formal evaluation ahead, he understood now that the journey itself had already changed him in ways that could never be taken back, regardless of what any panel of judges might ultimately decide. The morning of the evaluation arrived with a sharp, biting cold that seemed to seep into every corner of the city. Daniel woke before sunrise, his stomach twisted into knots so tight he could barely manage the small breakfast Grace had prepared for him. She had risen early despite her recent illness, insisting on pressing his shirt one final time, and combing his hair carefully, her hands trembling slightly as she straightened his collar. She said little, but the fierce pride shining in her tired eyes told Daniel everything he needed to know about how much this day meant to her as well. They walked together toward the conservatory building, Grace insisting on accompanying him despite the lingering weakness from her illness, unwilling to let her son face such an important moment entirely alone. Alaric met them near the entrance, dressed more formally than Daniel had ever seen him, his usual severe expression replaced by something closer to quiet tension. He offered Grace a respectful nod before turning to Daniel, checking once more that his student remembered the order of pieces, the small technical details that might otherwise slip away under pressure. Inside, the evaluation room felt even more imposing than it had during their private rehearsal days earlier. 5 members of the conservatory board sat behind a long wooden table positioned at the front of the room, each dressed in formal attire that spoke of decades spent within these very walls. Victor Langley sat at the center, his expression unreadable, flanked by colleagues whose faces ranged from mild curiosity to open skepticism. Margaret Ashwell had also been granted permission to observe, seated slightly apart from the panel, her presence offering Daniel a small measure of comfort amid the otherwise unfamiliar and intimidating surroundings. Daniel took his place at the piano positioned at the center of the room, aware of every eye fixed upon him, aware of his mother standing quietly near the back entrance, her hands clasped tightly together with hope she could not fully disguise. Victor Langley cleared his throat and formally welcomed him, explaining the evaluation structure in a tone that carried more procedure than warmth, before instructing Daniel to begin with his prepared technical piece. For a brief, terrifying moment, Daniel's mind went completely blank, the notes he had practiced countless times, suddenly slipping just beyond his reach. He glanced instinctively toward Alaric, standing near the side wall, and found his teacher's steady gaze fixed on him, offering silent reassurance without a single spoken word. Daniel drew a slow breath, closed his eyes briefly, and let his fingers find their way onto the keys, trusting the countless hours of practice to carry him forward even as nervousness threatened to overwhelm him entirely. The technical piece unfolded with careful precision, each passage executed with the discipline Alaric had worked so hard to instill over the preceding months. Daniel felt his confidence building gradually as the piece progressed, the familiar structure guiding him steadily toward its conclusion. When he finally lifted his hands from the keys, he caught a brief exchange of glances among several panel members, expressions of cautious approval that offered him a small measure of relief, though Victor Langley's face remained carefully neutral throughout. A short pause followed as the panel conferred quietly among themselves, jotting notes that Daniel could not read from where he sat. Then Langley addressed him directly, instructing him to proceed with his second piece. The composition of his own choosing meant to reveal whatever unique quality had drawn such attention to his unusual candidacy. This was the moment Daniel had both anticipated and dreaded throughout the preceding weeks, understanding that unlike the structured technical piece, this performance would offer no safety net of memorized precision to fall back upon should nervousness overtake him. He closed his eyes once more, and this time, rather than fighting against the fear pressing down on his chest, he allowed himself to fully release it, letting every emotion of the past difficult months rise freely to the surface. He thought of his mother's trembling hands that morning, of the fever that had left her pale and weak just weeks earlier, of the countless nights she had come home exhausted from scrubbing other people's floors to keep food on their own table. He thought of the rain soaking through his shoes outside a locked community center door, of Oliver Barrington's condescending smile, of Alaric's furious shout on that first unforgettable night, and of the strange, unexpected kindness that furious man had shown him ever since. His fingers began to move, slowly at first, drawing out a melody heavy with sorrow that seemed to fill every corner of the formal, tradition-bound room. Gradually, the music built in intensity, weaving moments of quiet vulnerability together with sudden surges of determined strength, mirroring the journey that had brought him to this exact moment, seated before 5 strangers who held the power to open or close the door to his future. He played without any conscious awareness of technique or structure, guided entirely by instinct, by the same mysterious inner voice that had first stopped Alaric in his tracks many months earlier. The room around him seemed to fade away entirely as he played, the formal panel, the watching portraits lining the walls, even his own nervousness dissolving into nothing beneath the overwhelming pull of the music itself. He poured every ounce of hardship and hope he had ever carried directly into the keys beneath his fingers, and somewhere within that outpouring, something shifted, transforming raw emotion into something that felt, even to Daniel himself, like genuine artistry rather than simple release. When the final note finally faded into silence, Daniel opened his eyes slowly, momentarily disoriented by the sudden return of his surroundings. For a long, agonizing moment, absolute silence filled the room, broken only by the faint sound of his mother softly weeping near the back entrance. Then Margaret Ashwell rose from her seat, her expression filled with the same astonishment she had shown weeks earlier at her private gathering, and began applauding warmly, her enthusiasm quickly spreading through several members of the watching panel. Victor Langley remained still for several long seconds, his expression carefully composed despite the visible emotion rippling through the rest of the room. Finally, he set down his pen and looked directly at Daniel, his voice noticeably softer than it had been throughout the formal proceedings. He admitted, with evident reluctance, that in over 20 years of evaluating young musicians, he had rarely witnessed a performance carrying such raw, undeniable authenticity, regardless of the unconventional path that had led the boy to this room. The panel withdrew briefly to deliberate, leaving Daniel standing near the piano, his legs weak with relief and lingering adrenaline, his mother rushing forward to embrace him tightly the moment the panel members had exited the room. Alaric approached more slowly, though the pride etched across his usually stern features spoke louder than any words he might have offered. He placed a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder, telling him quietly that regardless of whatever decision emerged from the deliberation, he had just delivered the finest performance of his young life, one that had clearly moved even the most skeptical members of a notoriously difficult panel. When the board members returned some 20 minutes later, Victor Langley delivered their decision with the same formal precision that had characterized the entire evaluation, though a genuine warmth had crept into his voice that had been entirely absent at the morning's beginning. The panel had voted unanimously to offer Daniel a full scholarship to study at the conservatory, an honor rarely extended to candidates without years of prior formal training, granted in recognition of what Langley described as an extraordinary and rare musical gift that deserved every opportunity to be properly cultivated. The small room erupted into a celebration that felt strikingly out of place within its usually solemn walls. Grace wept openly now, no longer bothering to hide her emotion, embracing her son again and again, as though she could not quite believe the moment was real. Margaret Ashwell offered warm congratulations, already speaking enthusiastically about future performance opportunities she intended to arrange, while even several previously skeptical panel members approached Daniel to offer their genuine admiration for what they had witnessed. News of Daniel's acceptance spread rapidly through the city's music community over the following days, reaching even Oliver Barrington, whose earlier condescension gave way, however grudgingly, to reluctant respect for a boy he had once dismissed so casually. The story of the self-taught musician who had first been discovered playing without permission on an empty concert hall stage soon became something of a local legend, retold with growing admiration among students and teachers alike, a reminder that extraordinary talent could emerge from places least expected by those who judged worth through wealth and privilege alone. In the months that followed, Daniel began his formal studies at the conservatory, walking each morning through halls lined with portraits of accomplished musicians who had come before him, no longer feeling like an outsider intruding on a world that did not want him. Alaric continued guiding him closely, their relationship having evolved far beyond the icy formality of their earliest lessons into something resembling genuine friendship built on mutual respect. Grace, finally able to reduce her exhausting workload thanks to the financial relief the scholarship provided, watched her son's continued growth with a quiet joy that had replaced years of worry and uncertainty. Years later, when Daniel eventually took his place on stages far grander than the one where his journey had first begun, he would often close his eyes before beginning to play, just as he always had, drawing the audience into that same private world where instinct and feeling mattered more than any rule ever could. And somewhere in the wings of whatever hall he performed in, Alaric Voss could usually be found watching quietly, the same stern conductor who had once shouted furiously at a soaked, trembling boy for daring to touch his precious piano, now standing as proud witness to everything that unexpected encounter had ultimately made possible. The boy who had never been allowed to dream had proven, through nothing more than the honest sound of his own two hands, that talent asks for nothing but the chance to be heard.